And so I think it's interesting to see, how this plays out, and I think what that means from an overall staffing perspective, which leads us to the next story that I found absolutely fascinating that you brought up. This one's from the New York Times, um, and basically a little bit of an expose. Everyone's favorite target these days is Amazon, and there's been obviously a lot of talk about the way they've treated their factory workers and all the automation. But this article is talking about how coders are they in fact the next warehouse workers for Amazon, where the work of coding, which has always been, half art, half science, is now
Mhm.
being reduced to all science or all maybe not even science anymore, right? But the use of AI coding tools basically is turning the act of development into one that, at least depending on your perspective, is much more automated, routine, less art, less creativity. And really, I think the relevance here is, if you're a CIO, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is this, this fundamentally is about the democratization of development, something that many enterprises have almost moved away from doing development. And so, what does this what does this mean? And I'm curious. You brought this article up. How you see this. I mean, which way are you landing on this one?
Yeah, it's been no secret that in the past, that modern coding is a combination of Lego blocks and strategy, where a lot of what you're doing in coding is actually pulling code off of existing libraries or existing repositories to do what you need, rather than trying to write code from scratch. That's just the reality of the job nowadays, and that's getting increasingly easy with the likes of AI. And I think this is a fundamental change again in the nature of work, that we now have different units that are, call it, one level up from what we're used to thinking about as the fundamental building blocks of work, and coders are no exception. I see this as just being one piece of that larger trend that is happening in terms of digital white collar work. We have to stop thinking about simply looking at data at the most granular level or code at the most granular level and thinking that is the job. Because if you think that is the job, it's being automated. That is now calculator work at the end of the day. And your job is to figure out how to work the calculator, not to imitate the calculator.
Well, what I think is interesting from a couple standpoints. One is the irony is not lost on me that the biggest impact, and I think clearly the biggest use case for generative AI right now is in fact to replace coders, or to reduce the increase the productivity of coders by doing automated coding, which I think is, juicily ironic, given that it's tech that's displacing tech.
Yes.
Um, but I also think that it's interesting because, in fact, I haven't actually talked to any of the folks like at places like Mendix or OutSystems or Appian recently, but I'm curious of how this is impacting them, because if you really think about what this represents, is that it's sort of taking the same promise of what the low code, no code players were always about, which is this idea that I can abstract away the complexity of coding and use this platform to create an application. But you were then invested in this platform, right? I mean, OutSystems did code generation, but for the most of them, they were model driven systems where you had to be using their platform to continue to operate the environment. Um, but what is interesting, I remember talking to an executive years ago, and he at the time he was running an ISV, and I interviewed him for CIO.com as for an article, because they had effectively abandoned hand coding and were exclusively using OutSystems.
Mhm.
And I said, why? And he said, well, we realized that the value that we provided wasn't our ability to know the syntax of a code. It was to understand the business process and to create a better approach to managing those workflows and business processes. And I think that's what this is coming to a head, that if your expertise was, I had memorized the syntax, then you're, like any other job that I can reduce it to that level, then I'm going to automate it. But if what made you a great coder was your ability to see and understand the business process and understand how to build something that was going to optimize that and make it run more effectively, well, then you're just changing your tool set. And I think that's going to be the divide we're seeing. So I think it's interesting in this article that it spoke to developers that were, or engineers were on both sides of this, that saw this as just turning them into code monkeys, where they were just going through and it was monotonous, and others saw this as liberating. And I think the divide was very clear. Those that had that art, that had the ability to see the business process, to see the how to extract value, this was a great tool. And those that their value was in, I know the syntax, they're
Mhm.
going to be much less, have a much better, worse position. So quite interesting. And I'm curious, if you were advising a CIO, what would they take from all of this?
Yeah, I think it is much more important now to hire people who conceptually understand their jobs, much less important to focus on specific languages or specific capabilities, because honestly, syntax isn't that important. Like, and there's that goes to an extreme. For instance, I've learned SQL back in my day, and it's very helpful for understanding how structured data works and working with relational databases and understanding how queries work. But I'm probably never going to have to write a single SQL query again in my life, and that's okay. It's more important to have that systematic conceptualization in my head and be able to figure out how that works in light of all of the other interfaces that I'm going to have. Everything from GUIs to agents and to working with apps, and being able to see, okay, here's what you're actually doing with the data. That part is extremely useful, but testing me on my ability to use SQL as a standalone capability, frankly, I don't think that's going to be a very useful exercise for
It,
all
it
but the most detailed data analyst work.
Well, and it does beg a question or a concern, though, and that is that you brought up a really good point, that the act of coding also informs the underlying architecture and design, right? They go together. And I think, there's a phrase from a writing perspective that writing is thinking, right? And so sort
Mhm,
of the same idea. And I do worry a little bit. I mean, I remember when my older kids were um, like late teenagers, and at the time everyone was talking about how technology, that this is the first generation, so my older kids generation, the first generation that were what we call them, digital natives, right, that
mhm,
they grew up using tech, and everyone said, oh, they're going to have this huge leg up. And I remember talking to them about it, right, being a tech person,
mhm,
and realizing that we'd have these conversations, and they intuitively and instinctively understood how to use technology and had zero idea about how any of it actually worked beneath the
mhm,
covers, right? They were just consumers, so they were digital native consumers. And I'm a little bit concerned about what this, does this bode negatively for enterprises, that I'm going to end up with a generation of, the late Glenn O'Donnell, a Forrester analyst, used to call them faux engineers, right?
mhm.
This whole class of tech people within enterprises that literally don't actually know how any of this technology works, because they are using AI tools, and they've been so abstracted away that God help them if it breaks. I mean, I don't
Yes,
know what.
we're all vibe coders. I think we're reaching, but we're reaching a weird point where we're going to have to accept that there are times in our lives, or in our kids' lives or the next generation's lives, they need to. They're going to have time frames, like multi-year long time frames, where they are worse at their job at AI, but they have to actually learn these skills to get good at whatever they're doing. And I think there's this fundamental misalignment between that level of training and how education is currently set up. So I just said, yes, you don't have to test people on SQL, but I do think people should, going into data, should know how the data works. They should know how a circuit works. Yes, you're never going to have to deal with this from a formal perspective, but you should still have an understanding of how the technology works.
It makes me wonder if we're going to end up with a new liberal arts curriculum, right? Because that's really, if you think about liberal arts, is sort of that same thing, right? Get educated in the classics, not because you're going to use it, but because it teaches you how to learn, it teaches you how to comprehend. And I almost wonder if we're going to have something similar. It's like where we need to train people on the liberal arts of technology. Not that you're going to actually do any of this stuff, but you have to understand the underpinnings of it. I mean,
Yes, like
there's
Latin helps me to understand how agents are chunked. Like it's not that understanding quo usque tandem abutere, whatever, Catalina Patientia Nostra is going to help me, to write out an agent, but I can, but understanding how that grammatical structure is tokenized, like these things all come together.
get that Latin on. Okay, well.